Today's episode is brought to you by Mazars.
SoundCartel.
Divorce is tough, but when a family business is entangled in the whole relationship breakdown, with emotions, business and financial worries all colliding, how much harder can things get? From SoundCartel, I'm Nicole Goodman, and this is Business Essentials Daily. The best outcomes can be found if the separating couple remain sensible and amicable, of course. But that's not always possible, agrees Kim Hanrick, a partner at Mazars with years of experience working with family businesses of all sizes. Kim's also a tax specialist with some words of warning shortly about how tax issues can turn around and bite you, perhaps years after the event. Heather Dawson asks Kim first what he sees as the main consequences of a divorce in family businesses.
For a small family partnership business, the consequences of divorce can be catastrophic, as in many cases both partners often have roles in the SME, and the business will face headwinds where the parties have to work together on a daily basis. In these situations, the parties are not normally prepared for the consequences. However, with larger family-controlled businesses, there is in most cases a partner who is the lead person, and that person in many cases becomes the ultimate controller of the business. It is common for non-active partners to take a sideline position and to allow the business to continue in order to maintain its profitability and value.
But what can happen if things don't go quite so smoothly, or if there's, antagonism in the mix?
Well, Heather, if the business is not managed well and the divorce proceedings get in the way, then there could be significant adverse financial implications to the business, which could ultimately lead to liquidation and ultimate financial loss of the business to both parties. The focal point is to maintain the business in a stable and profitable position.
But in the event that that outcome can't be achieved, Kim, how typically does a business or its assets get divided up in the event of a divorce?
What normally happens is, firstly, the business is valued by a professional person or persons, and the lawyers and accountants work together for the parties towards an agreed value. That percentage then, that each partner would be entitled to in the business, is then agreed to by the parties and or their lawyers, and if no agreement is reached, then it's primarily up to the courts and a legal process, which of course is very expensive.
So it can get quite messy, can't it, if the separation isn't amicable, which is probably quite often the case?
I would suspect that's the majority of cases, that they aren't necessarily that amicable for lots of reasons, and they become more aggressive because of people's different views of a whole host of things, including values and money.
What's your advice about the tax considerations couples should think about if they're getting divorced?
I would take a robust approach to the tax considerations because I think initially they are probably one of the least issues, given the fact that the state and federal governments understand the complications and the issues associated with divorce and subsequent family property settlement. So the stamp duty and capital gains tax issues are really set aside for the purposes of establishing who's going to get the benefit of what assets. But if I were to be involved in something like this, I would be making it very clear to the party or the parties that there are taxes that will emerge over a period of time that have nothing to do with the divorce proceedings, and those taxes invariably become capital gains tax simply because, on day one of the property settlement, both parties go their respective ways and hopefully happily so. Then in many years later, one of the parties who probably benefited by the acquisition of the assets decides to sell, then there's a capital gains tax liability, and the capital gains tax liability effectively reverts back to the original cost of the asset, not the assets that were established and those values established at the date of the family property settlement. So I think that needs to be made very clear because people forget and don't want to remember those particular sort of issues many years down the track. And then it becomes, let's have another crack at this, but obviously you can't when there's a court-ordered property settlement.
So things can come back to bite you later.
They could do if it's not done clearly, but again, that's what the professions are all about, making sure that people are very aware and informed about what all aspects of their businesses are about.
Well, Kim, from your experience as a tax specialist, what are your tips to help manage a business during a divorce?
Heather, first of all, I'll put on a cap not as a tax specialist but as a professional, and my first comments to the parties would be to stay focused on the assets. They must work together in maintaining the value of those assets until a settlement is reached. From my position, I would compile a detailed report on all aspects of taxation. And also I've mentioned earlier that there are mechanisms within the provisions of both the state and federal systems to assist parties with property settlements and divorce. I would still make sure that the parties understand the tax position post-settlement, because the parties at some stage will sell assets that were part of the family pool, and then that, of course, will give rise to a capital gains tax position in most cases. And, of course, then the party who sells the asset will be disappointed by the fact that they now have a capital gains tax liability, which they may not have been aware of at the time of the property settlement proceedings.
Well, some expert advice from outside the family can be very helpful, can't it? So who should a couple consult about the business if they're obviously heading into a divorce?
I believe the first thing is that expert independent advice is very important, and I do stress on the reference to independent. Couples who have businesses usually engage an external accountant. That person normally assists with the most aspects of business, including taxation, compliance, audit, and many other attributes of business services. It is my opinion that that person who's had foremost knowledge and day-to-day workings with that organisation and those clients should initially make recommendations as to the process of working to an amicable property settlement. That person must outline that they cannot act for both parties, and that independent professionals will need to be engaged for each of the parties. So what my final point is here is that this whole aspect of divorce and property settlements, of course, can become a very expensive exercise. And it's very important that the teams on either side work together, both accountants and lawyers and valuers for that matter, so three professional parties work together to try and not get the best for themselves, but to get the best for their clients. And in doing so, working and understanding that they might be arguing and fighting over a sum of money, which in the whole scheme of things could very well be a minute amount of money when it's allocated across all of the aspects and assets of the family pool, not just the business. So on a single piece of paper, you can sit down and you can apply a notional number of values which will give you the matrix to work through what is the high end and what's the low end, and where the values then sit on the basis of the dividing up of the assets, and whether it be on a percentage basis that might be start at 50-50 and move to a 70-30 or whatever it might be. I'm sure that the cost of getting there could very well outweigh the arguments of each of the values that each of the different experts have come up with as to those values. So my point is to come to a very sensible and amicable way of assessing those values.
That was Mazars partner and tax specialist Kim Hanrick. This episode of Business Essentials Daily is produced by the team at SoundCartel. Thanks for listening. I'm Nicole Goodman. We'll bring you more Be Daily tomorrow. Follow @BE Daily Podcast across social media and head to bedaily.com.au for more from the Business Essentials Daily podcast. SoundCartel. This episode was brought to you by Mazars. To find out more, visit mazars.com.au. That's mazars.com.au.